One of the lesser known and less promoted concepts of Wing Chun is that where it comes from, the earliest sources that we have of Wing Chun come through Lung Jan. We know his family owned a military prep academy, and Foshan was a hotbed of the gentry-led militia movement. And one of the things that we know is that kind of standard militia armaments were often spear and shield. Now, the shield wasn't like this. It was usually a rattan shield, which I don't happen to have. But, you know, this doesn't have a tip on it, but this is the kind of pole. The guys over at Kung Fu Tea actually have done a lot of research on this and have several articles talking about these things. And then the sidearm for your spear wielders or spear and shield wielders, because not all of them had shields, some of them were just spear, was the butterfly knife, which would be tucked in a sash, which I don't have a sash, and sometimes it would be a single, and quite often it would be a double. Now, I've discussed this before, but the reason the pole is tapered is because getting the counterweight on the butt end of the pole was more expensive than was feasible, so getting a tapered pole provided the counterbalance for them. Rattan shields, obviously rattan is much easier to work with than hardwood and metal. And the knives, which we know were only used by the militia and not used by the main military, were essentially your backup weapon. They were your sidearm. So I'm going to put these down now, and let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. When we look at the Wing Chun knives, and granted, they are not only used in Wing Chun, they're used in quite a few Southern styles. They are very much a Southern tool, not a Northern one. What we do know about them and their use, they didn't show up until roughly like the 1820s, 1830s or something like that. And their construction is very similar to a Western parrying dagger. Now, I don't have a parrying dagger at hand. Parrying daggers tended to have a thinner blade than this, more like a standard dagger. Not all of them had horns, some just had a regular crossguard, but many did actually have horns. Most of them did not have D-guards, but I like the D-guard well enough. So essentially, as a sidearm in the militia, you would have one or a pair of these. Now, not everybody in the militia was a spearman. Some actually had access to muskets, some were archers, and some would even have dows. Chinese sabers. And again, this is a backup tool for that. So that's one thing that we need to understand. Back to the spear and shield idea for a moment. What is the purpose of the shield? Obviously to deflect attacks. Now, unlike say a Roman scutum, right, that protects a ton of your body, this kind of barely protects my torso. So when you use a shield, you tend to keep it out a little bit more, and you have to have enough room to make way for your spear. So if you're using a large one-handed spear, how are you going to use it? You're going to use it down here. You're going to be blocking and deflecting and stabbing up and around the pole as you move. This is going to be an active defense. It's not a passive defense. It's a little more passive than something smaller like say a buckler, but it's still an active defensive tool. Let's go west for a minute. So if we go sword and buckler, the Italian fencing system that I primarily study, Marazzo, has a lot of sword and buckler stuff. In fact, he's got a lot of sword and various types of shield or various types of secondary implement. The sword being a one-handed sword. In modern day, we would call this a side sword. May or may not be a historical term. What does this protect? Just about nothing, right? And people often say, well, you can punch people with it. Yeah, sure you can, right? But that's not its primary purpose. When you look at sword and buckler movements, the hands travel together. So when I cut or I thrust, the buckler is actually protecting my sword hand. And I have to keep things away from my body. I'm using distance, and I am using coverage of the line more so than a passive guard. This is a very active guard. If that makes sense, let's go back to our knives. When you have two short knives, essentially you're fighting with two parrying daggers. Now, generally speaking, throughout history, We often see people using paired weapons like this outside of China. We often see people using paired weapons like this are kind of viewed as amateurs or fanboys, at least among the HEMA community they are. And generally speaking, you would have a longer weapon and a shorter weapon. Generally, you're not going to be dual wielding swords. Marazzo does cover that. Like, yes, is it a thing? Yes, because people have been mall ninjas forever and they want to do cool things, and I get that. But why do we have two knives? Well, maybe my shield gets busted. Just pretend, right? Maybe my spear gets busted. Does it seem better to have two than one when you're facing a larger opponent? Sure. And if they're both parrying daggers and they have some hooking and parrying capability, then yeah, maybe that's okay. But what do we look at? Why do we call our knives bacham-do? Bacham-do really means, 8 cutting, knives, 8 cutting blades. Okay, right? But the number 8 also means all, everything, all around, right? It is an inclusive thing. Basically meaning you can cut in all directions. What's the other common name for these? Hoodie dao, butterfly knives. Same concept, right? Fluttering around like butterfly wings. What do those things imply? And if we think back to our sword and buckler, what are we talking about? These things are moving very close together. We don't have them split. This does not offer me a ton of coverage, right? So as I move things, I have to keep one controlling the line, the other one attacking, and then maybe changing, right? We are doing a fairly ambidextrous art, and you can make cases for and against that, but we're doing a fairly ambidextrous art. So it makes sense that we want the hands close together. Now, let's say we put the big one back in the hand. So again, I don't have a European parrying dagger at hand, but what if I have, we'll call this a parrying dagger and I have my sword. Now, the parrying dagger is going to be dealing with things that come close, as the sword deals with things that are farther out, right? Defense, offense, but not always exclusively. Sometimes you do get close enough to use the dagger for defense, but they still go together. Your guards may be more split because you have a little more point authority here as long as you are forward with your point, right? Your guards may be more split, but as you're clearing the line, you're directly attacking. Things like that become extremely important, keeping the hands close together. So what is the overall point of this? Well, the overall point of this is that when we come to our empty hands, it is very important that we understand that our hand techniques should be closely paced together. Go back to the video where I talked about Faan Sau, right? The Faan Sau must not remain video. The concept of the Faan Sau, the concept of the returning hand, right? You are cycling your hands quickly. You are keeping the density tight. Tight, thick density is important because the more time that you give your opponent between beats, the more chance they have to adjust to things. So as you're doing things stay tight, the hands stay close. Even if you're playing just defense, things move tight and together, and you try not to split out and open things up too much because then you increase your risk. Now, obviously there are always going to be cases where you end up abandoning center line. There are going to be cases where you break structure, right? All those things, like, if it works, it's not wrong, but we still want to build our baseline on reliability. And the principle that we're looking at is we are a 4-limbed art, right? 2 hands, 2 legs, and we want to keep all our limbs, we want to keep all our weapons in the fight for as much of the time as possible so that we have an active capability for defense, offense, control, what have you. So when we look at this, now I should say this, right? Empty hand techniques do not translate well to weapons. However, weapons translate beautifully to empty hands. It's kind of a one-way road. And people will like to say, oh, people reverse engineer the hand techniques from Chun for the knives. Well, if that's true, it's backwards. But the fact is, I think that a lot of people, because the Wing Chun community has done such a poor job of preserving the knives, I think that people feel like they are reverse engineering these things, except studying fencing, I can tell you our hand techniques look a lot more like fencing than fencing looks like hand techniques. And so, don't get it twisted, the direction things go. People might be reverse engineering and they might be coming to the right conclusions for the wrong reasons. But ultimately what we're talking about here is that your fencing techniques, whether you're talking spear or blade or stick, whatever, do translate to your empty hands. And because of the critical nature of weapons combat, it gives you much more respect for things like the center line and for lines of control and clean lines of attack that don't allow for doubling or afterblows. Those are things that you learn much more respect for through the arts of fencing. Now, if you don't have access to the fencing arts that are native to your style, that's okay. You can still learn the necessary lessons by taking up a different kind of a fencing art. Make sure it is an actual combative fencing art. I'm not talking about Olympic fencing. I am talking about historical, tried and true, traditional fencing methods, whether we're talking HEMA, or we're talking Filipino martial arts, or we are talking Japanese sword arts, or we're talking Kobudo. Any of those kind of things, depending on what you're looking at, you will gain so much more appreciation for what's going on in your handwork when you understand the fencing aspect of it. And historically speaking, we know, like in the West, so many of the old-timey bare-knuckle boxers were also said to have been fantastic fencers or single-stick players. That is an important thing. Understanding your time and measure and critical stakes becomes an extremely important thing there. And so looking at things that way is definitely going to help. Hell, if you look at, say, one of Ramsey Dewey's videos where he talks about different combinations for the speed bag, I believe it's that video. He is talking about how so many of your hand techniques on the speed bag are not punches, they're blocks, they're chops, they're clearing motions. It's the same thing. Speed bag work is essentially the same thing as what we're doing in Wing Chun. In fact, if you're doing Wing Chun, I recommend you get a speed bag and start working on those things, because that is really, really useful stuff. It's the same as I'm putting my buckler out there and striking right around it. I deflect, I shield, I blind, whatever I do, I cut, I thrust, I recover the line, I keep moving, position to position, guard to guard, cut, thrust over and over and over again, right? And when we look at the Eastern arts, what do we see in Japanese grappling arts? They all say, oh, well, this is based on armor and swordsmanship. Nah, not all of them, but for the most part, right? This is based on samurai warfare, armor, and swordsmanship. What do we see in the Chinese arts? Pretty much every Chinese style has at least one associated weapon. The majority of them do. There may be one or two outliers, but the majority of them have at least one weapon. Now, does that mean they all come from military styles? No, it doesn't. But even folk styles, right? When you talk about, especially Southern China, when you talk about Southern Chinese martial arts, banditry and piracy was a big deal, was a big thing, right? And we're talking massive warring states periods. People had to protect themselves, and carrying weapons was just part of the gig. So when you look at this, right, Chinese martial arts, weapons and empty hands. When you look at English empty hand arts, weapons and empty hands. When you look at Japanese, right, weapons, empty hands. We see this over and over and over again. And again, don't think that your boxing techniques are going to translate to your sword techniques. It may give you a sense of timing and positioning, and that's good. But the fencing is actually what refines it. It's so much so. And I can tell you, fencing with some of these guys who could not hold their own for more than 5 seconds in a boxing ring, you just can't get in on them. They understand their tempo and measure so well. It's a fairly one-way street. So if you understand whatever the lesson the fencing is trying to teach you, bring that back into the empty hands, I promise you, you will be better for it. So I think I've rambled on enough, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, give the dog a bone. You can follow us on our other social media accounts, and if you really like us, you can head over to Amazon and buy a shirt. You can also go over to Gumroad and purchase some of our instructional courses. All of the links will be provided and also on our website. If you happen to be in the Phoenix area, we would love to meet you. Come drop in for a class, even just to chat. And if you're looking for a new home, we would be happy to have you. So until next time, good journey.